Before you drift into sleep tonight, let yourself settle deeply into comfort. Feel the weight of your body supported, your breath slowing naturally, your mind beginning to quiet. Tonight, we'll travel together through one of humanity's greatest mysteries, a story that unfolds across frozen landscapes and ancient coastlines, through discoveries that have rewritten what we thought we knew about our past. Let the rhythm of this tale carry you gently toward rest, as we explore the fascinating question of who first set foot in the Americas, and when and how they made that remarkable journey across a world so different from our own. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a vast museum hall, dim lights casting soft shadows across display cases. In one case, you see a beautifully crafted stone point, its surface fluted with expert precision. This simple tool holds within it a century of scientific debate, passionate arguments, revolutionary discoveries, and the gradual unraveling of a theory that once seemed unshakable. As you begin to relax, let your mind wander back through the millennia to a time when massive ice sheets covered much of North America, when the very shape of the continents looked different, when the first humans gazed upon landscapes no person had ever seen before. Our story begins not in the deep past, but in the American Southwest during the 1930s, when the science of archaeology was still establishing its methods and the question of America's first inhabitants remained wrapped in speculation and myth. In 1929, a 19-year-old man named Ridgely Wetman made a discovery near the town of Clovis, New Mexico, that would shape archaeological thinking for the better part of a century. He had been following news of exciting discoveries at nearby Folsom, where ancient spear points had been found embedded in the bones of extinct bison, proving that humans had lived in North America during the Ice Age. Whiteman found similar artifacts near a place called Blackwater Draw, and soon professional archaeologists arrived to excavate what would become one of the most important archaeological sites in the Americas. Between 1932 and 1937, researchers uncovered a remarkable assemblage of stone tools at the Clovis site. The most distinctive were spear points with a unique characteristic, a channel or flute removed from each face of the base, creating a groove that would have helped secure the point to a wooden shaft. These Clovis points, as they came to be known, were exquisitely crafted from high-quality stone, demonstrating sophisticated knapping techniques. The points measured typically between 3 and 6 inches in length, with carefully worked edges sharp enough to pierce the thick hide of Ice Age megafauna. They were found in direct association with the bones of mammoths, mastodons, and extinct species of bison, leaving no doubt that humans had hunted these massive creatures. What made the Clovis discovery so influential was not just the beauty of the artifacts or the dramatic association with extinct animals, but the timing. The radiocarbon dating technique, developed in the late 1940s, eventually placed the Clovis culture at approximately 13,000 years ago, during a period when the great ice sheets that had covered much of North America were beginning their final retreat. Here, it seemed, was clear evidence of the continent's first inhabitants, a people who had arrived from Asia by crossing a land bridge over what is now the Bering Strait, then spread rapidly throughout North and South America, hunting the great herds of Pleistocene megafauna with their distinctive stone-tipped spears. The Clovis first theory crystallized into an elegant narrative that explained the peopling of 2 entire continents. According to this model, groups of Paleolithic hunters from Siberia had crossed the Bering Land Bridge sometime around 13,500 years ago, following herds of mammoth and bison. They traveled through an ice-free corridor that had opened between 2 massive ice sheets, one covering much of Canada and the other extending down from the Rocky Mountains. This corridor provided a pathway from Alaska into the heart of North America, and once through this bottleneck, the Clovis people spread with remarkable speed. Within perhaps 500 years, their distinctive stone points appeared at sites from Alaska to the southern tip of South America, suggesting a rapid expansion of a single highly successful culture. The theory had powerful appeal. It was straightforward, supported by clear archaeological evidence, and consistent with what was then understood about Ice Age geography and climate. The Clovis points themselves became a kind of archaeological signature, so distinctive that they could be identified immediately. They represented what archaeologists call a diagnostic artifact, something so specific in form that it marks the presence of a particular culture. Sites with Clovis points were found across North America, in the Great Plains, the Southwest, the Southeast, even up into Canada. The technology appeared fully formed, suggesting that these people had brought a sophisticated hunting toolkit with them from Asia. For decades, The Clovis first model dominated discussion of human migration to the Americas. It was taught in every archaeology classroom, appeared in every textbook, shaped research agendas and funding decisions. The model became not just a theory but a paradigm, a framework through which all other evidence was interpreted. When archaeologists found older sites or sites that seemed older, they faced tremendous skepticism. The burden of proof was enormous. Any claim that predated Clovis required extraordinary evidence, impeccable excavation techniques, undeniable stratigraphy, and dates that could withstand the most rigorous scrutiny. Many promising sites were dismissed or marginalized because they didn't fit the Clovis first chronology. The theory also suggested something about the nature of the first Americans themselves. They were envisioned as big game hunters, highly mobile, following herds of mammoths and mastodons across vast territories. Their culture seemed to emphasize large prey animals, and the rapid spread of Clovis technology suggested both the effectiveness of their hunting methods and perhaps a population expansion driven by abundant resources. The disappearance of mini-Ice Age megafauna around 11,000 years ago, shortly after the appearance of Clovis culture, led some researchers to propose that Clovis hunters had actually driven these animals to extinction through overhunting, though this overkill hypothesis remained controversial. Yet even as Clovis first became archaeological orthodoxy, there were troubling questions that didn't quite fit the neat narrative. If Clovis people had migrated from Siberia through Alaska and down through Canada, why weren't there distinctive points found along that route? The evidence in Alaska and northern Canada was sparse and ambiguous. Moreover, radiocarbon dating sometimes suggested that Clovis sites in South America might be as old as those in North America, which would be strange if people were migrating from north to south. And there were those persistent claims of older sites, dismissed by most researchers but never entirely forgotten, that hinted at a human presence in the Americas that predated Clovis by hundreds or even thousands of years. The Clovis people themselves remained mysterious in many ways. Only one burial had ever been found with clear Clovis associations, a young boy discovered near the town of Anzick in Montana. The child had been buried with more than 100 stone and bone tools, all stained with red ochre, suggesting elaborate burial practices and deep symbolic thinking. But beyond this single example, the Clovis people left no cemeteries, no clear house structures, no obvious settlements. Their archaeological signature consisted primarily of stone tools and the butchered remains of the animals they hunted. They appeared suddenly in the archaeological record, flourished for perhaps 500 years, and then their distinctive tool technology vanished, replaced by different styles of projectile points. As the 20th century progressed and archaeological techniques became more sophisticated, as radiocarbon dating was refined and new scientific methods were developed, the questions surrounding Clovis first began to multiply. The theory that had once seemed so solid, so obvious, began to show cracks. And it was at sites far from the Great Plains of North America, in places like a rock shelter in Pennsylvania and a creek bank in southern Chile, that the Clovis first paradigm would finally begin to crumble. The challenge to Clovis first began quietly, in places that seemed unlikely to revolutionize archaeological thinking. One of these was a rock shelter called Meadowcroft, located in the rolling hills of southwestern Pennsylvania, not far from Pittsburgh. In the early 1970s, archaeologist James Adavaggio began excavating this site, which had been used as a shelter by humans for thousands of years. The rock overhang had protected deposits of ash, tools, and organic materials, creating a deep stratigraphy that recorded successive occupations stretching back into the past. As Adavaggio and his team carefully excavated the layers at Meadowcroft, working with painstaking precision to document every artifact and feature, they began to find evidence that troubled them. Deep in the stratigraphic sequence, well below layers containing clear evidence of later prehistoric cultures, they discovered stone tools and charcoal from fire pits. When these materials were radiocarbon dated, the results came back suggesting human occupation as early as 16,000 years ago, thousands of years before Clovis. The team documented everything meticulously, photographing and mapping each find, collecting samples for multiple types of dating. They were well aware that any claim of pre-Clovis occupation would face fierce opposition from the archaeological establishment. The finds at Meadowcroft included what came to be known as the Miller-Lanceolate Point, a stone projectile about 3 inches long with a distinctive shape that didn't resemble Clovis points at all. This artifact was clear proof that sophisticated toolmakers had been in the region before the Clovis culture developed its characteristic technology. Even deeper in the deposits, the team found what they called the Mongai knife, a finished lithic tool dated to approximately 16,000 years ago. The evidence seemed undeniable. People had been at Meadowcroft long before Clovis people appeared in the archaeological record. Yet the announcement of these findings, when they came to light in the late 1970s, met with intense skepticism from much of the archaeological community. Critics questioned every aspect of the excavation and analysis. Could the radiocarbon dates be trusted? Might the charcoal samples have been contaminated by older coal deposits known to exist in the area? Were the stone tools really the work of humans, or could they be naturally fractured rocks that only resembled artifacts? The debate became heated and sometimes personal. Adavajo spent years defending his findings, publishing detailed reports, hosting visits from skeptical colleagues, submitting to intense scrutiny of his methods. The site became a test case for how claims of pre-Clovis occupation would be received. While Meadowcroft faced skepticism in North America, an even more dramatic challenge to Clovis first was developing far to the south, in the temperate rainforest of southern Chile. Here, near the modern town of Puerto Montt, a stream called Chinchihuapi Creek meandered through a landscape of lush vegetation and rolling hills. In 1975, a veterinary student visited the area and was shown what local farmers thought was a cow bone they had found along the creek bank. The bone proved to be from a gomphotherium, an extinct elephant-like creature that had roamed South America during the Ice Age. This discovery caught the attention of Tom Dillahay, an American anthropologist working at the local university, who decided to investigate the site more thoroughly. What Dillahay found at Monteverde would ultimately prove more revolutionary than anyone could have imagined, though it would take more than 2 decades for the archaeological community to accept his findings. The site sat beneath a layer of peat, an oxygen-poor environment that had preserved organic materials in extraordinary condition. As excavations proceeded through the late 1970s and 1980s, Dillahay and his international team uncovered evidence of a complete forager campsite dating to approximately 14,800 years ago, more than 1,000 years before Clovis. The preservation at Monteverde was unlike anything previously seen at an early American site. Wooden tent stakes remained in place where they had been driven into the ground. The foundations of a long rectangular structure could still be traced, showing where poles had been set to support hide or bark coverings. Inside this communal dwelling, separate living spaces could be identified, each with its own small hearth lined with clay. Food remains included not just bones from now extinct animals like paleocamels and gomphotheres, but an astonishing array of plant materials. Wild potatoes, edible seeds, medicinal herbs, and most remarkably 9 different species of seaweed that had been brought from the Pacific coast, some 30 miles away. The preservation of these organic materials allowed Dillahay and his colleagues to reconstruct the lives of Monteverde's inhabitants in unusual detail. They had harvested and used at least 60 species of plants for food and medicine. They had created sophisticated tools not just from stone but from wood and bone. They had spun grass into cordage for rope. They had maintained hearths and living spaces with clear evidence of structured domestic life. And they had done all this not during some brief hunting expedition, but apparently as part of a settled encampment where they lived for an extended period. Critically, the Monteverde people did not make Clovis points. Their stone tools were simpler, often just river cobbles with one edge flaked to create a sharp working surface. This suggested they were not descended from Clovis people, or alternatively, that Clovis technology had not yet been invented when Monteverde was occupied. Either way, the implications were profound. If people were living in southern Chile 14,800 years ago, they must have arrived in the Americas well before the Clovis culture appeared. And if they had traveled overland from Alaska to Chile, the journey would have required even more time, pushing back the initial arrival date even further. Yet when Dillahay began publishing his findings, the response from much of the archaeological community was skeptical, bordering on hostile. The Clovis first paradigm was so entrenched that many researchers simply couldn't accept evidence that contradicted it, no matter how carefully documented. Some questioned the radiocarbon dates, suggesting contamination from younger materials. Others questioned whether the wooden structures might be natural formations rather than human constructions. The debate became acrimonious at times, with careers and reputations at stake. Through the 1980s and early 1990s, claims of pre-Clovis sites continued to emerge, only to be contested and often dismissed. At Topper in South Carolina, at Cactus Hill in Virginia, at Bluefish Caves in the Yukon, archaeologists found evidence suggesting human presence before Clovis times. Each site faced intense scrutiny and skepticism. The archaeological community had developed what might be called a Clovis first reflex, an instinctive rejection of any claim that didn't fit the established chronology. The burden of proof for pre-Clovis sites was extraordinarily high, while Clovis first itself, having achieved paradigm status, faced relatively little critical examination. But paradigms in science, no matter how powerful, must ultimately yield to evidence. And by the mid-1990s, the weight of evidence challenging Clovis first had become difficult to ignore. Multiple sites were producing dates older than Clovis. New analytical techniques were confirming those dates. And most importantly, Monteverde was about to undergo a test that would finally break the Clovis first monopoly on interpretations of American prehistory. In 1997, an event occurred that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of archaeological research into the first Americans. A group of 12 distinguished archaeologists, many of them strong proponents of Clovis first, traveled to southern Chile to inspect the Monteverde site firsthand. This blue ribbon panel included some of the most respected names in Paleo-Indian archaeology, researchers whose opinions carried enormous weight in the field. Tom Dillehay, who had spent 2 decades excavating the site and defending his interpretations, understood that this visit represented both an opportunity and a risk. If these skeptical experts rejected Monteverde, his life's work might be permanently marginalized. If they accepted it, the implications would reshape American archaeology. The panel spent days examining the site and the artifacts. They studied the stratigraphy, the layers of sediment that preserved the chronological sequence. They inspected the wooden artifacts, the plant remains, the stone tools, all the materials that Dillehay had carefully preserved and documented. They reviewed the radiocarbon dates, the excavation photographs, the detailed maps and drawings. They asked probing questions about every aspect of the interpretation. And when they finally rendered their verdict, it was decisive. Monteverde was genuine, the dates were reliable, and people had indeed been living in southern Chile at least 14,800 years ago, more than 1,000 years before Clovis. The acceptance of Monteverde by this panel of skeptical experts marked a watershed moment in American archaeology. The Clovis first paradigm, which had dominated thinking for more than 60 years, was no longer tenable. If people were in southern Chile 14,800 years ago, they must have entered the Americas considerably earlier, perhaps 16,000 years ago or more, to allow time for the journey from Alaska to Chile. The ice-free corridor through Canada hadn't opened until about 13,000 years ago, which meant the first Americans couldn't have used that route. Suddenly, alternative theories of migration, particularly the idea of coastal migration, gained new credibility. The site itself, when examined closely, told a story far richer than simply humans were here. The location at Monteverde sat on a small creek bank in a landscape of temperate rainforest, with mountains rising to the east and the Pacific Ocean lying 30 miles to the west. When people lived there 14,800 years ago, during what geologists call the Younger Dryas climate period, the environment was colder and more open than today, but it still offered abundant resources for those who knew how to exploit them. The main residential structure at Monteverde had been built with remarkable sophistication for such an ancient site. Wooden poles, the remains of which could still be seen embedded in the ground, had been set in parallel rows to create the framework for a long building. Hides or bark would have covered this frame, creating a communal shelter large enough to house perhaps 20 to 30 people. Within this larger structure, the builders had created about 12 smaller living spaces, each defined by wooden partitions or walls. It was remarkably like an apartment building, with separate families or social units occupying individual sections of the communal dwelling. Each living area contained a small hearth, carefully constructed with a lining of clay to protect the wooden floor. These hearths were not simply holes for fire, but carefully engineered features that would have provided warmth, light, and cooking facilities while minimizing the risk of the entire wooden structure catching fire. Around the hearths, the excavators found food remains: bones from mastodon and paleocamel that had been butchered and cooked, charred seeds and tubers, and fragments of the medicinal and edible plants that the inhabitants gathered from the surrounding landscape. About 100 feet from the main residential structure, Dillahay's team found evidence of another building with a wishbone-shaped floor plan. This structure contained stone tools in various stages of manufacture, suggesting it had been a workshop area. Here too were bones from large animals, but these showed evidence of butchering and processing rather than consumption. This spatial organization, with separate areas for living and working, indicated a level of social complexity and planning that many archaeologists had not expected to find at such an early site. The plant remains from Monteverde provided perhaps the most detailed picture ever recovered of the diet and resource use of early Americans. The people living at this site had been sophisticated botanists, with knowledge of at least 60 different species of useful plants. They gathered wild potatoes from the forest floor, collected nuts and berries when they ripened, harvested edible seeds, and knew which roots and tubers could be dug and eaten. They also used many plants medicinally, including species that indigenous people in the region still use today for treating wounds, stomach ailments, and respiratory problems. Most remarkably, the Monteverde people had collected and brought back to the site 9 different species of marine algae, or seaweed, from the Pacific coast. This required a journey of some 30 miles each way, suggesting regular contact with the coast and deliberate effort to obtain these marine resources. Some of the seaweed species were edible and rich in iodine and other nutrients. Others had medicinal properties or could be used for various practical purposes. The presence of beach-rolled pebbles at the site, stones that could only have come from the ocean shore, confirmed that the inhabitants made regular trips to the coast. These findings suggested that the Monteverde people were not primarily big game hunters focused on killing mammoths and mastodons, as Clovis people were often portrayed. Instead, they were generalized foragers with a broad-spectrum economy, gathering plant foods, hunting whatever game was available, and exploiting marine resources when they could access them. This economic pattern made sense for people living in the resource-rich environment of the Chilean coast, where the ocean, rivers, forests, and grasslands all offered different foods at different seasons. The stone tools from Monteverde were notably simple compared to Clovis points. Most were unifacial tools, meaning they were flaked on only one side to create a sharp edge. River cobbles had been selected for their appropriate size and shape, then modified minimally to create working implements. There were no elaborate projectile points, no sophisticated flaking techniques, none of the technical virtuosity seen in Clovis stone working. This simplicity might reflect different functional needs, or it might indicate that these people had not yet developed the specialized hunting technologies that Clovis people would later perfect. Or perhaps it simply meant that they relied less on stone tools and more on organic materials like wood, bone, and plant fiber. When Dillahay and his team returned to Monteverde in 2013, at the request of Chile's National Council of Monuments, they made additional discoveries that pushed the date of human presence even further back. In stratigraphic layers below the main occupation level, they found evidence of earlier, more ephemeral human presence. Stone artifacts and fire pits in these deeper layers dated to approximately 18,500 years ago, though these findings remained more controversial and less widely accepted than the main Monteverde II occupation. The acceptance of Monteverde fundamentally changed the conversation about the first Americans. It proved that the Clovis culture, whatever its importance, was not first. It demonstrated that people with different technologies, different economies, and different ways of life had been in the Americas before Clovis points were invented. And it opened the door for serious consideration of other pre-Clovis sites that had previously been dismissed or marginalized. The paradigm shift was underway, and archaeology would never see the peopling of the Americas in quite the same way again. Yet even as Monteverde overturned Clovis first, new discoveries were being made that would push the date of human arrival in the Americas back even further, to a time that seemed almost impossible. These discoveries would come not from excavations of stone tools or hearths, but from the most ephemeral and personal of archaeological remains, footprints preserved in ancient lockshores. The story of what may be the oldest clear evidence of humans in the Americas unfolds in an unlikely setting. A vast expanse of brilliant white gypsum sand dunes in southern New Mexico. White Sands National Park preserves the world's largest gypsum dune field. A surreal landscape of undulating white hills that seems more like a science fiction moonscape than a place where crucial evidence of human history would be preserved. Yet beneath and between these dunes, exposed periodically by wind erosion, lie the fossilized footprints of people who walked these lands during the last glacial maximum, the coldest period of the last ice age. The footprints were first noticed by David Bustos, a resource manager at White Sands, who had been documenting trackways of extinct animals across the ancient lake beds exposed by erosion. In 2009, he noticed what appeared to be human tracks among the animal prints. These weren't isolated prints but extensive trackways showing clear human locomotion. Over the following years, as more tracks were exposed and carefully excavated, researchers realized they had stumbled upon something extraordinary: hundreds of human footprints preserved in multiple distinct layers of sediment, representing different episodes of human activity spanning thousands of years. The setting for these footprints was dramatically different from today's arid desert. During the late Pleistocene, roughly 23,000 to 21,000 years ago, the Tularosa Basin was home to a large body of water called Lake Otero, or Paleo Lake Otero as geologists now call it. This was a true lake, not just a seasonal playa, fed by streams running down from the Sacramento and San Andres Mountains. Around the lake's margins, where the land stayed wet but periodically dried out, conditions were perfect for preserving footprints. People and animals walked across the damp sediment, leaving impressions. As the sediment dried and hardened, thin layers of clay and silt were deposited over the tracks, sealing them in place. This process repeated multiple times, creating a stratigraphic record of human activity. The footprints themselves are remarkably detailed, showing individual toes, the balls of feet to heels, even the texture of the sole of the foot. Many are clearly from people walking barefoot, though some may have worn soft moccasins or foot coverings that left no distinct impression. The sizes of the prints reveal who was walking these ancient shorelines. The vast majority were made by teenagers and children. Adult-sized prints are relatively rare. One trackway shows what appears to be a woman or adolescent male walking with a very young child for over a mile. At certain points along this trackway, it appears the older person was carrying the child, as evidenced by deeper footprints and signs of slipping under the additional weight. The person then set the child down, and both sets of prints continue. Later, the trackway shows the adult's return journey, but the small child's prints are absent, suggesting the child had been left at the destination. This single trackway tells a poignant human story. We can imagine a mother or older sibling carrying a toddler across the muddy margins of the ancient lake, perhaps traveling between campsites or going to collect water or food resources. The child was sometimes carried, sometimes walked alongside. When the adult reached the destination, the child stayed there while the adult made the return journey alone. It's a scene that would be unremarkable except for its age. This walk happened more than 20,000 years ago, during the height of the last ice age. Other trackways reveal different aspects of ancient human behavior, White Sands. Some show people walking quickly, purposefully, in straight lines that suggest they knew exactly where they were going. Others meander, with frequent changes in direction, as if the person was searching for something or exploring. A few trackways show evidence of people slipping or stumbling on the slick mud. And in one particularly intriguing set of prints, a person's tracks suddenly show signs of panic. Longer strides, deeper toe impressions indicating running. Nearby are the tracks of a giant ground sloth. It appears the human and the sloth encountered each other, and one or both fled from the confrontation. The animal tracks preserved alongside the human footprints provide a window into the Ice Age ecosystem of the Tularosa Basin. Mammoths had clearly been regular visitors to the lakeshore, leaving enormous tracks in the mud. Giant ground sloths, creatures that could stand over 10 feet tall, also frequented the area, their distinctive claw marks showing where they had walked on their hind legs. Dire wolves, camels, and other extinct species all left their marks. In several places, these animal tracks intersect with human prints, showing that people and megafauna shared the landscape, sometimes within hours or days of each other based on the stratigraphic sequence. The dating of the White Sands footprints sparked intense scientific controversy that continues to resonate today. The initial dates, published in 2021, relied on radiocarbon analysis of seeds from an aquatic plant called Ruppia serosa that were found embedded in the sediment layers containing the footprints. These dates indicated the tracks were between 23,000 and 21,000 years old, placing them firmly during the last glacial maximum. If correct, these dates would mean humans were in North America thousands of years before the Clovis culture, thousands of years before most scientists had thought the ice sheets would have allowed migration, and at a time when the prevailing assumption was that humans couldn't have survived in this region. Critics of the 2021 dating raised concerns about the reliability of radiocarbon dates from aquatic plants. Such plants can absorb carbon from old groundwater that has been leaching through ancient rocks, a phenomenon called the hard water effect that can make the plants appear older than they actually are, sometimes by thousands of years. If the Ruppia seeds had been affected by this problem, the footprints might be much younger than the initial date suggested, perhaps only 15,000 or 13,000 years old, which would still be significant but less revolutionary. To address these concerns, researchers returned to White Sands in 2022 and 2023 and took a completely different approach to dating. Instead of dating plant materials, they extracted samples of the ancient mud itself from the layers containing the footprints. This mud was then radiocarbon dated using organic material distributed throughout the sediment. The samples were sent to two completely independent laboratories, both of which reported the same age range, between 20,700 and 22,400 years old. This closely matched the original dates based on plant seeds, providing strong confirmation that the footprints really were made during the last glacial maximum. In a further effort to confirm the ages, researchers also used a different dating method called optically stimulated luminescence, which dates sediments based on when they were last exposed to sunlight. This technique measures trapped electrons in quartz grains, providing an age estimate independent of radiocarbon dating. These luminescence dates also supported the 21,000 to 23,000 year age range for the footprints. Additionally, pollen grains from extinct conifer species found in the footprint layers were radiocarbon dated, again producing ages consistent with the last glacial maximum. By 2023, researchers had 3 independent lines of evidence, all pointing to the same conclusion. Humans were walking the shores of Lake Otero in what is now New Mexico around 23,000 years ago. This was during the coldest period of the last ice age, when ice sheets covered much of North America, when sea levels were 400 feet lower than today, when the Bering Land Bridge connected Asia and Alaska. It was a time when most scientists had assumed humans couldn't have been south of the ice sheets, yet here were their footprints, preserved in multiple stratigraphic layers showing repeated human presence over thousands of years. The White Sands footprints raised as many questions as they answered. If people were in New Mexico 23,000 years ago, how did they get there? The ice-free corridor through Canada, the traditional route proposed for human migration, didn't open until around 13,000 years ago, long after these footprints were made. Did these people come down the Pacific coast, traveling by boat or along the shoreline? If so, where is the archaeological evidence of their presence in Alaska and along the coast? And if they were here 23,000 years ago, where did they go? Why don't we find more archaeological sites from this period? The absence of stone tools or other artifacts at White Sands also puzzled some researchers. If people were walking these ancient lockshores for thousands of years, leaving hundreds of footprints, where are their campsites, their fire pits, their discarded tools? The researchers who studied the site had an explanation. The trackways represent brief, transient movements across the landscape, people traveling from one place to another in journeys that might have taken only minutes or hours. Hunter-gatherers living in this environment would have been careful with their possessions. carrying their tools with them rather than leaving them scattered along travel routes. The people who made these footprints lived in a dramatically different world than we inhabit today. The last glacial maximum, from roughly 26,000 to 19,000 years ago, was a time when Earth's climate had cooled to its most extreme point during the last ice age. Ice sheets 2 miles thick covered Canada and extended south into what is now the northern United States. So much water was locked up in these glaciers that global sea levels stood approximately 400 feet lower than they are today. The Bering Land Bridge, connecting Asia and Alaska, was not a narrow strip of land but a vast plain stretching hundreds of miles from north to south. A genuine subcontinent that geologists call Beringia. This was the world the first Americans knew, a world of ice and cold, but also a world of opportunity for those who could adapt to its challenges. Yet here at White Sands, far south of the ice sheets, life continued. The climate was certainly colder than today, and the landscape was more open, with fewer trees and more grassland. But Lake Otero provided water and attracted animals. The surrounding mountains received enough rainfall to feed streams. People could survive here, and the footprints prove they did, not just briefly but for thousands of years. The repeated occupation shown by multiple trackway horizons spanning from 23,000 to 21,000 years ago indicates this was not a single group passing through, but rather evidence of human populations living in this region, adapting to the environment, raising children, and thriving even in the coldest period of the Ice Age. The White Sands discovery forced archaeologists to confront uncomfortable questions about when and how humans first arrived in the Americas. If people were in New Mexico 23,000 years ago, the entire timeline of human migration needed to be reconsidered. The ice-free corridor, the traditional route envisioned for human entry into the Americas, didn't exist at that time. The massive Cordilleran ice sheet covering British Columbia and the Laurentide ice sheet covering much of Canada were at their maximum extent, pressed together without any gap between them. There was no corridor, ice-free or otherwise. So how did these people get to New Mexico? To understand how humans could have been in the Americas 23,000 years ago, we need to turn our attention to a place that no longer exists. The land bridge called Beringia that once connected Asia and North America. This wasn't just a narrow strip allowing passage from one continent to another. Beringia was a genuine geographic region, a vast landscape that existed for tens of thousands of years, shaping both the environment and the people who lived there. The formation of Beringia was a consequence of Earth's climate cycles. During ice ages, water evaporates from the oceans and falls as snow on polar regions, where it accumulates in massive ice sheets rather than returning to the oceans. As more and more water becomes locked in ice, sea levels drop. During the last glacial maximum, so much water was trapped in ice sheets that sea levels fell approximately 400 feet below present levels. This drop in sea level exposed the shallow seafloor of the Bering Strait, creating a continuous landmass between Siberia and Alaska. But Beringia was not merely exposed seafloor. It was a distinct ecological region with its own climate, vegetation, and animal communities. At its greatest extent, Beringia stretched about 600 miles from north to south and extended perhaps 1,000 miles from the edge of the Asian continental shelf to the edge of the North American continental shelf. This was an area larger than Texas, a genuine subcontinent that existed for tens of thousands of years. Geologists have determined that the land bridge first emerged around 35,700 years ago, remained exposed for roughly 10,000 years, then was briefly submerged before re-emerging around 24,000 years ago and persisting until about 11,000 years ago when rising sea levels finally drowned it for the last time. The climate of Beringia during the Ice Age was harsh but not uniformly frozen. While surrounded by ice sheets to the north and east, and by tundra to the west, the central regions of Beringia apparently remained ice-free. The climate was cold and dry, more arid than the surrounding regions because the massive ice sheets disrupted normal weather patterns. This aridity prevented heavy snow accumulation, meaning that unlike much of Canada and Siberia, Beringia did not develop its own ice sheet. Instead, it was a cold, wind-swept landscape covered with grasses, sedges, and occasional stands of hardy shrubs. This vegetation supported a remarkable community of Ice Age megafauna. Mammoths browsed on the grasses, their massive bodies insulated by thick fur against the cold. Horses, quite different from modern domestic horses but similar in size and form, grazed across the plains in large herds. Bison, larger than modern species, also roamed Beringia. Predators included cave lions, short-faced bears, and dire wolves. It was a productive ecosystem, similar in some ways to the African savanna but adapted to cold conditions, sometimes called the mammoth steppe. For humans, Beringia represented both a highway and a homeland. Genetic evidence suggests that the ancestors of Native Americans spent a considerable period of time in Beringia, isolated from both their Asian ancestors and the populations they would eventually give rise to in the Americas. This period of isolation, which geneticists call the Beringian standstill, may have lasted several thousand years, from perhaps 25,000 to 20,000 years ago, though the exact dates remain uncertain and continue to be refined as more genetic data becomes available. During this standstill period, the ancestral Native American population was not large. Genetic analysis suggests a population bottleneck, meaning the total number of people may have been only a few hundred to perhaps a few thousand individuals. This small population became genetically isolated, cut off from their Asian relatives by changing climate conditions or by the sheer distance and difficulty of travel. During these millennia of isolation, they developed unique genetic markers that distinguish Native Americans from all other human populations. They adapted to the Beringian environment, developing hunting strategies for mammoth and other large game, learning to survive the extreme cold and seasonal darkness of near-Arctic latitudes, and maintaining their culture through generations of living in this harsh but stable environment. The archaeological evidence for human presence in Beringia during this period is sparse, partly because much of the region now lies beneath the Bering Sea and partly because Ice Age sites in Alaska are rare and difficult to find. However, a few tantalizing discoveries hint at this ancient occupation. The Bluefish Caves in the Yukon Territory of Canada have yielded bones of Ice Age animals with cut marks that might indicate human butchering, dated to around 24,000 years ago, though these findings remain controversial. In Alaska itself, sites like Swan Point and Broken Mammoth contain evidence of human occupation dating back to about 14,000 years ago, after the main migration to the Americas had already occurred, but demonstrating that people did live in Alaska during the later stages of the Ice Age. The Beringian environment would have demanded remarkable adaptability from its human inhabitants. Winters would have been long, dark, and extremely cold. Summer provided a brief window of longer days and milder temperatures, but even summer in Beringia would have been chilly by modern standards. People living there would have needed sophisticated clothing, probably made from animal hides and furs, sewn with bone needles using sinuous thread. They would have required reliable methods for making and maintaining fire, perhaps carrying embers with them as they moved across the landscape or using fire-making tools like drills or strikelights. Shelter might have consisted of hide-covered structures built with wooden frames and weighted down with stones, similar to structures known from other Arctic sites. The social organization necessary for survival in Beringia would have been complex. Hunting large animals like mammoths required cooperation among multiple hunters, probably groups of related males who had trained together in hunting techniques. Processing a mammoth carcass, which could weigh several tons, required the labor of many people and would have provided food for an extended group for days or weeks. The division of labor probably involved men hunting large game while women gathered plant foods when available, processed animal hides, sewed clothing, and managed domestic tasks. Children would have been taught survival skills from an early age, learning to identify edible plants, understand animal behavior, and master the crafts necessary for life in the far north. But Beringia was not just a place where people waited. It was actively lived in, a homeland for generations of people who knew its landscapes intimately, who had names for its landmarks, who buried their dead there and told stories about their ancestors. The genetic evidence of the Beringian standstill suggests that this period of isolation was crucial in shaping the Native American population that would eventually spread throughout the Western Hemisphere. When conditions changed and migrations into the Americas became possible, the people who made that journey carried with them the genetic legacy, cultural adaptations, and survival skills developed during their millennia in Beringia. The question of when and how people left Beringia for points south remains one of the most fascinating puzzles in American archaeology. For a long time, researchers assumed that the route southward led through an ice-free corridor between the massive ice sheets covering Canada. But as we'll explore, that corridor presented its own problems that forced archaeologists to consider alternative routes for the peopling of the Americas. For decades, the ice-free corridor seemed like the obvious answer to how people migrated from Alaska into the heart of North America. The theory was straightforward and elegant. As the Ice Age drew to a close and the climate began to warm, the massive ice sheets that covered Canada started to melt and retreat. The Laurentide ice sheet, which covered much of eastern and central Canada, and the Cordilleran ice sheet, which covered the mountains and coastal regions of western Canada, were pressed together during the height of glaciation. But as they began to shrink, a gap opened between them, creating a corridor of ice-free land running roughly from the Yukon Territory southward through Alberta and into the northern United States. This corridor would have provided a pathway for human migration, a route that avoided the impassable ice sheets to the east and west. Once through this bottleneck, migrants would have found themselves in the Great Plains of North America, a vast landscape teeming with game animals and offering abundant resources. From there, people could have spread rapidly throughout both continents. The ice-free corridor theory fit perfectly with the Clovis first model. The corridor opened around 13,000 to 14,000 years ago, right when Clovis people appeared in the archaeological record. It all seemed to make perfect sense. But as scientists learned more about the ice-free corridor, problems began to emerge. Geologists studying the ancient moraines, the ridges of rock and debris left by retreating glaciers, could reconstruct when different parts of the ice sheets melted. Climate scientists analyzing ice cores and ancient lake sediments could determine past temperatures and environmental conditions. Paleoecologists studying pollen and plant remains could reconstruct what vegetation grew where and when. And all these lines of evidence began to paint a picture of the ice-free corridor that was far less welcoming than previously imagined. The crucial finding was that the ice-free corridor opened later than archaeologists had thought. The two ice sheets finally separated around 15,000 to 14,000 years ago, but this didn't immediately create a viable migration route. When the ice first melted, what lay beneath was not welcoming grassland but a harsh, barren landscape scoured by glaciers. The retreating ice left behind vast lakes of meltwater, fields of broken rock, and ground that was still frozen beneath the surface. No vegetation grew there initially because the soil was essentially sterile, lacking the organic matter and nutrients that plants need. Without plants, there were no animals. Without animals, there was no food for human migrants. Studies of ancient DNA extracted from lake sediments in the corridor region have provided remarkable insights into when the environment became habitable. These DNA analyses can identify what plants and animals were present at different times by detecting traces of genetic material preserved in the mud at the bottom of ancient lakes. The results show that even after the ice melted, the corridor remained essentially lifeless for centuries. Not until around 12,600 years ago did sufficient vegetation colonize the region to support animal populations. This was the earliest point at which the ice-free corridor could have served as a viable migration route for humans. And by then, people had already been living south of the ice sheets for thousands of years, as demonstrated by sites like Monte Verde, White Sands, and Cooper's Ferry. The environmental conditions in the newly opened corridor would have been challenging in the extreme. The climate was still very cold, with short summers and long, harsh winters. The landscape was dominated by proglacial lakes, large bodies of water formed from glacial meltwater that had no outlet to the sea. Some of these lakes were enormous, covering hundreds or even thousands of square miles. Crossing these lakes would have been difficult, especially in a landscape with limited trees for boat building. The shores of these lakes were typically muddy, unstable, and difficult to traverse on foot. Even when vegetation began to colonize the corridor, it was at first dominated by mosses, lichens, and hardy grasses that could tolerate the harsh conditions. Only gradually did more substantial vegetation appear, willows and other shrubs, and eventually scattered trees. As plants established themselves, animals followed. First came small mammals like ground squirrels and rabbits. Later, larger herbivores like bison and elk moved into the corridor. Predators would have followed the prey animals. But this process of ecological succession took time, perhaps 1,000 to 2,000 years, meaning the corridor didn't become a reliable source of food until around 12,000 years ago or even later. For human migrants, this timing created an insurmountable problem if the ice-free corridor was supposed to be their route into the Americas. The corridor didn't become passable until around 12,600 years ago at the earliest, but people were clearly living south of the ice sheets well before that date. Monte Verde in Chile was occupied by 14,800 years ago. White Sands in New Mexico has footprints dated to 23,000 years ago. Cooper's Ferry in Idaho was inhabited by 16,000 years ago. All of these sites predate the opening of the ice-free corridor by thousands of years. Moreover, the archaeological record within the corridor itself doesn't show evidence of human presence during the critical period when the first migrations were supposedly occurring. If large numbers of people had traveled through the corridor on their way south, we should find evidence of their passage. Campsites, butchered animal bones, broken or lost tools, perhaps burials. But such evidence is largely absent or dates to much later times. The oldest well-documented sites in the corridor region date to after 13,000 years ago, and these appear to represent people moving north into the corridor from the south, not people moving south through the corridor from Alaska. There's also the question of whether people living in Alaska at the end of the Ice Age would have even known that the corridor existed or that it led anywhere useful. The corridor, when it first opened, was likely invisible from either end, hidden behind barriers of ice and mountains. People in Alaska would have had no way of knowing that hundreds of miles to the south, the ice sheets had separated. They wouldn't have known that an ice-free passage existed, much less that it led to unoccupied lands with abundant resources. Without such knowledge, why would they venture into an unknown and apparently endless expanse of ice and cold? All of these problems with the ice-free corridor theory forced archaeologists to reconsider how the first Americans had reached their destination. If not through the corridor, then how? The answer, increasingly supported by both archaeological and genetic evidence, lay not in the interior of the continent but along its edges, in the rich and productive environments of the Pacific coast. The idea that the first people to reach the Americas traveled along the Pacific coast rather than through an interior ice corridor represents a fundamental shift in how we understand human migration in the ancient world. This coastal migration theory, sometimes called the Kelp Highway hypothesis, proposes that people moved from Asia to North America by following the coastline, traveling by boat or on foot along beaches and rocky shores, exploiting the rich marine resources that these environments provided. The Pacific coast during the late Ice Age would have looked dramatically different from today. With sea levels 400 feet lower than at present, much of the continental shelf was exposed, creating a broad coastal plain between the mountains and the sea. Along much of the route from Asia to South America, this coastal plain would have been relatively ice-free even during the last glacial maximum. While massive ice sheets covered the interior of Canada, the coast itself remained accessible, kept relatively mild by the moderating influence of the Pacific Ocean. The key to understanding coastal migration lies in recognizing the extraordinary productivity of cold-water marine ecosystems. The Pacific Ocean along the coasts of Asia and North America supports vast kelp forests, underwater ecosystems dominated by large brown algae that can grow to enormous size. These kelp forests are incredibly productive, supporting a rich community of fish, shellfish, sea mammals, and seabirds. For humans with the knowledge and technology to exploit these resources, the coastline would have been like a highway lined with restaurants, offering abundant food supplies all along the route from northeastern Asia to southern Chile. The resources available in coastal environments were diverse and reliable. Intertidal zones, the areas exposed at low tide, offered clams, mussels, oysters, sea urchins, and other shellfish that could be gathered easily without sophisticated tools or techniques. Salmon and other fish migrated up coastal rivers to spawn, providing seasonal abundance that could be harvested with relatively simple equipment. Seals, sea lions, and sea otters hauled out on rocks and beaches where they could be hunted. Whales occasionally washed ashore, providing enormous amounts of meat, blubber, and bone. Seabirds nested in colonies on coastal cliffs, offering both eggs and adult birds as food sources. Edible seaweeds grew along rocky shores, providing vegetables rich in vitamins and minerals. Moreover, coastal resources were available year-round, unlike many terrestrial food sources that varied dramatically with the seasons. While plant foods in interior regions might be abundant in summer and scarce in winter, shellfish could be harvested any day of the year. Fish runs followed predictable seasonal patterns that coastal peoples could learn and anticipate. This reliability would have made coastal environments particularly attractive for human populations and would have supported relatively dense and stable communities. Archaeological evidence for coastal migration has been difficult to find, primarily because the coastlines where Ice Age people would have traveled are now underwater. When the ice sheets melted and sea levels rose, the ocean waters inundated the coastal plains where archaeological sites would have been located. Sites that were once on dry land are now submerged beneath 300 to 400 feet of water, out on the continental shelf. Finding and excavating such submerged sites is extraordinarily difficult and expensive, requiring specialized underwater archaeological techniques that have only recently been developed. Despite these challenges, evidence for early coastal occupation has begun to emerge. Along the coast of British Columbia, archaeologists have found evidence of human occupation dating back at least 14,000 years on islands that were part of the exposed coastal plain during the Ice Age. The Paisley Caves in Oregon, located in an ancient pluvial lake bed that was once connected to coastal rivers, contained human coprolites with dates around 14,000 years old. Channel Islands off the coast of California have yielded evidence of human presence going back at least 13,000 years, and some controversial evidence suggests even earlier occupation. Further south, evidence becomes more abundant. At Huaca Prieta on the coast of Peru, Tom Delahaye, the same archaeologist who excavated Monte Verde, found evidence of coastal occupation dating back at least 14,000 to 15,000 years. The people living there exploited maritime resources intensively, collecting shellfish, catching fish, and hunting marine mammals. The site shows clear evidence of boat use, as some of the resources could only have been obtained by traveling offshore. This demonstrates that coastal peoples of this period had developed maritime technologies that allowed them to exploit ocean resources effectively. At Cooper's Ferry in Idaho, the site we discussed earlier in relation to the White Sands footprints, evidence suggests a connection to coastal migration even though the site is located far inland. Cooper's Ferry sits along the Salmon River, a tributary of the Columbia River, which in turn flows to the Pacific Ocean. During the Ice Age, the Columbia River Valley would have provided a natural highway for people traveling inland from the coast. The western stem projectile points found at Cooper's Ferry show similarities to points found along the Pacific coast, suggesting cultural connections between coastal and interior populations. The site dates to around 16,000 years ago, before the ice-free corridor opened, which means the people who lived there must have arrived via a coastal route and then traveled up the Columbia River drainage. The Kelp Highway hypothesis suggests that this pattern of coastal migration followed by movement up major river systems may explain how people initially spread throughout the Americas. Starting from Beringia, early migrants would have followed the coast southward, exploiting marine resources and gradually expanding their range. When they encountered major rivers like the Columbia, they would have followed these waterways inland, discovering interior regions rich in terrestrial game and plant resources. This process would have been repeated all along the Pacific coast from Alaska to Chile, with different groups exploring different river systems, eventually spreading throughout the Western Hemisphere. This coastal migration model requires that early Americans had sophisticated maritime technologies, particularly boats. The evidence for boat use at this early period is indirect, since boats made from organic materials like wood, hide, or bark don't preserve well in the archaeological record except under extraordinary conditions. However, the very fact that people reached islands off the Pacific coast by 13,000 years ago or earlier proves they had watercraft. And the presence of sites on both sides of major rivers and inlets suggests routine water crossings that would have been difficult or impossible without boats. The type of watercraft used probably varied by region and resources available. In areas with large trees, dugout canoes could have been made by hollowing out logs, a technology that continues to be used by coastal peoples of the Pacific Northwest. In regions without suitable trees, boats might have been constructed from hides stretched over wooden frames, similar to kayaks or umiaks used by later Arctic peoples. These hide boats would have been lighter and more portable than dugout canoes, though perhaps less durable. Even simple rafts made from bundled reeds or driftwood could have served for short water crossings, though they wouldn't have been suitable for open ocean travel. The maritime adaptation implied by coastal migration represents a fundamentally different kind of economy than the big game hunting focus traditionally attributed to the first Americans. Instead of highly mobile hunters following herds of mammoth and bison across the plains, we now envision people living in semi-sedentary coastal villages, using boats to exploit marine resources, gathering shellfish along rocky shores, and occasionally venturing inland to hunt and gather terrestrial resources. This is a more complex, more diversified economy, one that would have supported larger and more stable populations than a purely terrestrial hunting lifestyle. Genetic evidence supports the coastal migration model in several ways. Studies of ancient and modern Native American DNA show that the ancestors of most Native Americans were isolated in Beringia until around 20,000 to 25,000 years ago, then began expanding rapidly. The pattern of genetic diversity suggests a relatively rapid spread of people throughout the Americas, which is more consistent with movement along a productive coastal corridor than with a slow, difficult trek through the ice-free corridor. Moreover, genetic studies of coastal populations show evidence of ancient maritime adaptations, including genetic variants that may have helped people digest a diet high in marine fats. The Kelp Highway hypothesis has become increasingly accepted among archaeologists as evidence accumulates. While it remains impossible to prove definitively without underwater archaeological discoveries that have yet to be made, the coastal migration model resolves many of the contradictions and problems that plagued earlier theories. It explains how people could have been in the Americas before the ice-free corridor opened. It accounts for the distribution of early archaeological sites along the Pacific coast and up major river systems. It provides a plausible mechanism for rapid population expansion throughout the hemisphere. And it aligns with our growing understanding that the first Americans were not a single, monolithic culture but diverse peoples with different technologies, economies, and ways of life. As evidence has accumulated from archaeological sites, genetic studies, and other scientific investigations, a new picture of the peopling of the Americas has emerged, one far more complex than the simple narratives of the past. Instead of a single migration of a homogeneous people, we now recognize multiple waves of migration, perhaps following different routes, bringing peoples with different technologies and cultural traditions, spreading throughout the Americas over thousands of years. The genetic evidence for multiple migrations is particularly compelling. Studies analyzing DNA from both ancient remains and modern Native American populations have identified at least 3 major streams of ancestry that contributed to Native American populations. The first and largest contributed to the vast majority of Native Americans from Canada to Chile. This ancestral population, descended from people who lived in Beringia during the last glacial maximum, spread rapidly throughout the Americas after the ice sheets began to retreat. Their descendants are found in virtually every region of the Western Hemisphere, though in varying proportions mixed with later arrivals. The second stream of ancestry appears in populations living in northern North America and is associated with the Na-Dene language family, which includes languages spoken by groups like the Navajo, Apache, and many peoples of Alaska and Western Canada. Genetic analysis suggests that these peoples' ancestors arrived in a separate migration, probably crossing from Asia into Alaska sometime after the main ancestral Native American population had already spread throughout the Americas. The timing of this migration is debated but probably occurred between 8,000 and 12,000 years ago. These Na-Dene peoples expanded from Alaska southward along the western mountains of North America, eventually reaching as far as the American Southwest, where Navajo and Apache peoples live today. The third genetically distinct stream is found in Inuit, Yupik, and Aleut peoples living in the Arctic regions of North America and Greenland. These populations are descended from peoples who crossed from Siberia to Alaska much more recently, within the last 5,000 years. Their arrival in the Americas occurred long after the initial peopling of the continents, but represents a significant migration nonetheless. Arctic peoples spread eastward across northern Canada and eventually reached Greenland, where they encountered and eventually replaced an earlier population called the Paleo-Eskimos, who had themselves arrived in the Arctic several thousand years before. In addition to these three major streams of ancestry, genetic studies have identified several puzzling signals that hint at even more complexity in the peopling of the Americas. Some populations in South America, particularly in the Amazon basin in Brazil, carry small amounts of genetic ancestry that appears to be related to indigenous peoples of Australia, Melanesia, and the Andaman Islands. This Australasian genetic signal, dubbed Population Y by researchers, is deeply mysterious. How did DNA from the opposite side of the Pacific Ocean end up in South American populations? Did some early migrants travel from Southeast Asia or Oceania directly to South America by boat? An extraordinary maritime journey that would have been unprecedented for its time? Or does the signal represent some very ancient Asian population that contributed to both Australasian peoples and some early Americans before later migrations diluted this signal elsewhere? The question remains unresolved, one of the most intriguing mysteries in the genetic history of the Americas. The archaeological record also reveals the diversity of early American populations. Different regions show different stone tool traditions, suggesting distinct cultural groups with their own technological approaches. The Clovis tradition, with its distinctive fluted points, appears primarily in North America and is found most commonly in the Great Plains and the Southeast. West of the Rocky Mountains, a different tradition called the Western stem tradition predominated, characterized by points with stems at the base rather than flutes. In Alaska and the far north, yet another set of tool types appears, some showing connections to Siberian technologies. These different tool traditions probably reflect genuinely different populations with distinct cultural heritages, not just different ways of making tools by the same people. The fact that these traditions existed side by side, sometimes in adjacent regions, suggests that early America was culturally diverse from the beginning. Rather than a single wave of settlement spreading a uniform culture across two continents, we see evidence of multiple groups with their own identities, technologies, and ways of life. Some of these groups may have been completely replaced or absorbed by later arrivals, leaving only faint traces in the archaeological or genetic record. The Paleo-Eskimos of the Arctic, for instance, appear to have been entirely replaced by the ancestors of modern Inuit peoples, though some genetic studies suggest limited interbreeding before the earlier population disappeared. In other cases, different groups mixed and intermingled, creating new populations with blended ancestry. The genetic structure of modern Native American populations reflects this complex history of migrations, interactions, and population changes spanning thousands of years. Recent research has also revealed that migration was not just a one-way process from Asia to the Americas. Genetic evidence shows that some Native American populations later migrated back across the Bering Strait from Alaska to northeastern Siberia, bringing American ancestry back to Asia. This back migration appears to have occurred several times over the last 5,000 years, creating populations in the Russian Far East that have both Asian and Native American ancestry. The Bering Strait region, rather than being a one-way gateway crossed once in the distant past, emerges as a zone of ongoing contact and exchange between Asian and American populations for thousands of years. The pattern of regional adaptation within the Americas also reveals complexity and innovation among early populations. People living in the Arctic developed specialized technologies for hunting marine mammals and surviving extreme cold. Groups in the Great Plains perfected techniques for hunting bison in large communal drives. Peoples of the Pacific Northwest developed complex maritime cultures based on salmon fishing and canoe travel. In the Andes, high-altitude populations adapted physiologically to life at elevations where the air is thin and oxygen is scarce, developing genetic changes that allowed them to thrive in an environment that would be extremely challenging for most humans. Each region of the Americas presented different challenges and opportunities, and the descendants of the first Americans rose to meet them with creativity and resilience. They diversified into hundreds of distinct cultures, speaking hundreds of different languages, practicing countless variations of human social organization and economy. From the caribou hunters of the Arctic tundra to the agriculturalists of the Mississippi Valley, from the maritime peoples of the Pacific Northwest to the highland civilizations of the Andes, Native American cultures demonstrated the full range of human adaptability and ingenuity. The timing of these various developments and migrations is still being refined as new discoveries are made and new analytical techniques are applied to existing evidence. Every year brings new archaeological finds, new genetic studies, new scientific analyses that add pieces to the puzzle. The picture becomes clearer but also more complex, revealing layers of history and human experience that had been invisible to earlier generations of researchers. One particularly intriguing recent finding involves evidence that some groups may have specialized in hunting particular species of megafauna. Analysis of protein residues on ancient stone tools has sometimes revealed which species were butchered with particular implements. Some sites show evidence of mammoth hunting, with bones broken open to extract marrow and tusks removed for raw material. Other sites focus on ground sloths, mastodons, or ancient horses. This specialization suggests that different groups may have developed particular expertise in hunting specific animals, passing down this knowledge through generations, perhaps defining themselves culturally by their hunting traditions. The disappearance of the megafauna themselves around 11,000 years ago added another layer of complexity to the story of the first Americans. Within a few centuries, dozens of species of large mammals went extinct throughout the Americas. Mammoths, mastodons, horses, camels, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, short-faced bears, and many others. The causes of this extinction event remain debated. Did human hunting pressure drive these animals to extinction? Did climate change at the end of the Ice Age disrupt their habitats and food sources? Were diseases involved, perhaps carried by humans or their dogs from Asia? Or was it some combination of these factors? Whatever the causes, the loss of the megafauna forced human populations to adapt, to find new food sources, to develop new hunting strategies, to adjust their cultures and economies to a changed world. Bringing together all the archaeological, genetic, and environmental evidence that has accumulated in recent decades, what can we now say with confidence about the first Americans? The picture that emerges is both clearer and more complex than what previous generations of archaeologists imagined. First, we can say that humans were in the Americas much earlier than the Clovis first theory suggested. Multiple lines of evidence now point to a human presence in the Americas by at least 16,000 years ago and possibly as early as 23,000 years ago or even earlier. The White Sands footprints provide direct evidence of human presence at 23,000 years ago. Cooper's Ferry in Idaho shows occupation at 16,000 years ago. Monte Verde in Chile demonstrates that people were living in South America by 14,800 years ago. Multiple other sites across the Americas, from Paisley Caves in Oregon to the Friedkin site in Texas to Cactus Hill in Virginia, have yielded evidence of pre-Clovis occupation that, while sometimes controversial, contributes to a growing consensus that people arrived in the Americas well before Clovis culture appeared. Second, we can say that these early Americans did not arrive via the ice-free corridor through Canada. That corridor didn't open until around 14,000 years ago at the earliest and didn't become environmentally viable for human migration until around 12,600 years ago. Since people were already living south of the ice sheets before that time, they must have arrived by some other route. The most plausible alternative is coastal migration along the Pacific shoreline, traveling by boat or on foot along beaches that are now submerged beneath the ocean. This kelp highway would have provided abundant marine resources and a viable migration route from Asia to South America. Third, we can say that the first Americans were not a single, monolithic culture but represented diverse populations with different technologies, economies, and ways of life. The distinctive Clovis culture was one such population, important and successful, but not the only or even necessarily the earliest people in the Americas. Western stem tradition peoples, whose projective points look quite different from Clovis points, may have been equally ancient or even older. Other groups left less distinctive archaeological signatures but were nonetheless real populations with their own cultural identities. Fourth, we can say that the ancestors of Native Americans spent a significant period of time in Beringia, the land bridge connecting Asia and Alaska, before moving south into the Americas. This Baronian standstill, as it's called, lasted for several thousand years during the last glacial maximum, a time when climate conditions may have made further migration difficult or impossible. During this period, the ancestral Native American population remained relatively small and isolated, developing unique genetic characteristics that distinguished them from Asian populations. When conditions changed and migration southward became possible, these Baronian peoples expanded rapidly, spreading throughout the Americas within just a few thousand years. Fifth, we can say that early Americans arrived during the last glacial maximum or shortly thereafter, at a time when the climate was dramatically different from today and the landscape was inhabited by now extinct megafauna. These people lived in a world of mammoths and mastodons, giant ground sloths and dire wolves, enormous bison and ancient horses. They witnessed the end of the Ice Age, the melting of the glaciers, the extinction of these great animals, and the transformation of the Americas into the environments we know today. Their cultures adapted to these massive changes, developing new technologies and economies to cope with altered circumstances. Sixth, we can say that the peopling of the Americas was not a single event but a process that unfolded over thousands of years and involved multiple migrations, multiple routes, and multiple populations. Some groups traveled along the coast, others eventually used the ice-free corridor once it opened. Still others may have taken routes we haven't yet discovered. Some migrations occurred during the Ice Age, others after it ended. The Americas were peopled gradually, in waves, with different groups arriving at different times and settling different regions. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, we must acknowledge how much we still don't know. For every question that recent research has answered, new questions have emerged. We don't fully understand the relationship between the Clovis culture and earlier populations. We don't know exactly when or by what routes the first migrants arrived. We don't know how many separate migrations occurred or how different migrant groups interacted with each other. We don't know whether climate change, human hunting, disease, or some combination of factors caused the megafaunal extinctions. We don't know how many archaeological sites have been lost to rising sea levels or other natural processes, or what evidence those sites might have contained. Recent archaeological work continues to produce surprises. At the Galt site in Texas, excavations have revealed a layer beneath the Clovis occupation containing different types of tools and dating to around 16,000 years ago. At the Chicwa White Cave high in the mountains of Mexico, controversial findings suggest possible human presence as early as 30,000 years ago, though many archaeologists remain skeptical of these extremely early dates. Along the coast of California, underwater archaeological surveys are beginning to locate submerged sites on the now flooded continental shelf, though excavating these sites presents enormous technical challenges. Genetic research continues to reveal new complexities in Native American population history. Ancient DNA extracted from human remains in Florida, Nevada, Alaska, and South America is being analyzed to understand the relationships between different early populations. Comparisons between ancient and modern genomes are revealing how Native American populations have changed over time, adapting to new environments, mixing with neighboring groups, and in some cases disappearing entirely. Each new genome sequenced adds depth and detail to our understanding of American population history. Scientific techniques continue to improve, allowing researchers to extract information from sites and artifacts that would have been impossible just a few years ago. Improved radiocarbon dating methods can now produce dates from smaller samples with greater precision. Protein analysis can identify which species of animals were butchered with stone tools even when no bones are preserved. Stable isotope analysis of human bones can reveal what people ate and where they lived during their lifetimes. LiDAR technology can detect subtle archaeological features beneath forest canopy, revealing sites that traditional survey methods would miss. Perhaps the most important development in recent years has been the collaboration between archaeologists and indigenous communities. For too long, research on the first Americans proceeded without meaningful consultation with or participation by the descendants of those first peoples. Native American communities have knowledge, perspectives, and interests that are crucial to interpreting the past. Many indigenous peoples have oral traditions recounting ancient migrations and historical events that, while not scientifically provable in a conventional sense, provide important context and alternative viewpoints. Increasingly, archaeological projects involve native consultants and collaborators, and some projects are initiated and controlled by indigenous communities themselves. These collaborations are not just ethically important, they also improve the quality of archaeological research. Indigenous knowledge about local environments, plants, animals, and traditional technologies can provide insights that archaeologists might miss. Consultation with descendant communities helps ensure that research is conducted respectfully and that human remains and sacred objects are treated appropriately. And involving native peoples in the research process helps connect academic archaeology with living communities for whom this history is not just an intellectual exercise but a story about their ancestors and their heritage. The debate over the peopling of the Americas has matured in recent years from bitter disputes over Clovis first to a more collaborative and multifaceted investigation that draws on many lines of evidence and many perspectives. While disagreements certainly remain on specific questions, there is now broad consensus on the main outline of the story. Humans arrived in the Americas earlier than previously thought, probably via coastal migration, during or shortly after the last glacial maximum, and diversified into the rich variety of cultures that inhabited the Americas when Europeans arrived thousands of years later. The sites and discoveries that have rewritten this history share certain characteristics. They are meticulously excavated and documented, with careful attention to stratigraphy and context. They employ multiple dating techniques to ensure reliability of chronology. They preserve unusual evidence, whether it's organic materials protected by peat at Monte Verde, footprints sealed in lakebed sediments at White Sands, or deeply buried deposits at Cooper's Ferry. And they have been subjected to intense scrutiny by skeptical colleagues, withstanding criticism and repeated testing to finally gain acceptance. This rigorous process of scientific investigation, challenging established theories, presenting new evidence, defending findings against skepticism, and ultimately building new consensus, is how science advances. The story of how Clovis first was overturned is a case study in scientific progress, showing how even deeply entrenched paradigms must eventually yield to accumulating evidence. It's a story of scientists willing to challenge orthodoxy, of skeptics keeping everyone honest through rigorous critique, and of a community eventually coming together around a new understanding better supported by the evidence. For those of us interested in human history, the story of the first Americans is endlessly fascinating precisely because it continues to evolve. Each new discovery adds detail to the picture. Each new analysis refines our understanding. We are privileged to be living through a period of revolutionary advances in our knowledge of how humans populated the Western Hemisphere. The technologies and techniques that have made these advances possible, from ancient DNA analysis to radiocarbon dating to sophisticated computer modeling, give us tools that previous generations of archaeologists could only dream of. Yet we must also maintain appropriate humility about what we know and what remains unknown. The archaeological record is fragmentary by nature, preserving only a tiny fraction of the material culture of ancient peoples and an even tinier fraction of their lived experience. Much of what happened in the deep past is simply lost to us, destroyed by natural processes, buried beneath the sea, or never leaving material traces that could fossilize. We must be cautious about building grand theories on limited evidence, while also remaining open to revising our understanding when new evidence emerges. As you let yourself drift toward sleep, let your mind wander across the immense span of time we've traveled tonight. 23,000 years ago, when glaciers covered much of the northern hemisphere and the sea level stood hundreds of feet lower than today, people were walking along the shores of ancient Lake Otero in what is now New Mexico, leaving footprints that would be preserved for us to discover millennia later. 15,000 years ago, families were living in a simple wooden structure on the banks of a creek in southern Chile, gathering seaweed from the Pacific coast and medicinal herbs from the forest, hunting ancient animals that no longer walk the earth. These were real people, with hopes and fears, with knowledge passed down through generations, with languages and stories and beliefs that shaped their understanding of the world. They looked up at the same stars we see, though from a world so different it might as well have been another planet. They felt the warmth of fire on cold nights, the satisfaction of a successful hunt, the joy of children playing, the grief of loss. They were fully human, as intelligent and capable as we are, facing the challenges of their world with courage and ingenuity. The children who played along that ancient lakeshore in New Mexico, whose small footprints we can still see, were just as curious, as energetic, as precious to their parents as children today. The mother or older sibling who carried a toddler for over a mile along the muddy shore, occasionally setting the child down to walk, was performing an act of care that parents everywhere would recognize. These intimate human moments, preserved accidentally in lakeside mud, connect us across the vast chasm of time to people who lived so long ago that their world was fundamentally different from ours, yet whose humanity was exactly the same. The story of how people first came to the Americas is still being written. Each year brings new discoveries, new sites excavated, new genetic analyses completed, new dates determined, new theories proposed. Underwater archaeologists are developing techniques to investigate submerged sites on the now flooded continental shelf, where the key evidence for coastal migration may lie. Geneticists are sequencing more ancient genomes, revealing the complex patterns of migration and mixture that created Native American populations. Climate scientists are refining their reconstructions of Ice Age environments, helping us understand the world the first Americans inhabited. There will be more surprises, more unexpected findings that challenge our current understanding. Perhaps someone will discover clear evidence of human presence in the Americas 25,000 or 30,000 years ago, pushing the date of arrival back even further. Perhaps underwater excavations will finally reveal well-preserved coastal sites with boats and maritime technology from the Ice Age. Perhaps genetic studies will identify additional migrations we haven't yet recognized. Or perhaps evidence will emerge that fundamentally changes our understanding in ways we can't currently imagine. This openness to new evidence, this willingness to revise our understanding when the data demands it, is the great strength of science. The archaeologists who spent decades defending Clovis First were not fools. They were working with the best evidence available at the time and had built a coherent theory that explained that evidence. When new evidence emerged that contradicted Clovis First, many resisted at first, as scientists naturally do when cherished theories are challenged. But ultimately the evidence won out. Sites like Monte Verde and White Sands were so well documented, so carefully excavated, so thoroughly dated, that they could not be dismissed. The paradigm shifted because it had to, because the evidence demanded it. This is how science progresses, not through sudden revelations but through patient accumulation of evidence, through careful excavation and analysis, through debate and critique and eventual consensus. The archaeologists who discovered and documented these sites, who spent years or decades of their lives doing painstaking work that would finally overturn Clovis First, were doing science as it should be done. Rigorously, carefully, with appropriate attention to detail and appropriate openness to being proven wrong. For indigenous peoples of the Americas, the scientific debates over when and how their ancestors arrived may seem somewhat beside the point. Many Native American communities have oral traditions that say their people have always been here, or that they emerged from this land rather than migrating from elsewhere. These traditions are not necessarily incompatible with scientific findings. They may encode deep historical memories in metaphorical rather than literal form, or they may reflect a perspective that emphasizes connection to place rather than origins elsewhere. The question of when ancestors arrived becomes less important than the fact that indigenous peoples have been in the Americas since time immemorial from any human perspective, that they developed rich cultures deeply rooted in these lands, that they are the descendants of the first Americans regardless of exactly when those first arrivals occurred. The archaeological story of the first Americans, meanwhile, continues to unfold. We know so much more than we did 20 or 30 years ago, yet we remain humbled by how much remains to be discovered. Somewhere beneath the Pacific Ocean, sites preserve evidence of coastal migration that would answer many of our questions. Somewhere in Alaska or Beringia, sites document the lives of people during the Bering standstill. Somewhere in the Americas, undiscovered sites contain evidence that will surprise and enlighten us, that will add new chapters to this story. As you settle into sleep tonight, you might reflect on this grand journey of discovery, Not the ancient journey of the first Americans, but the modern journey of scientists working to understand that ancient past. It's a story of persistence and patience, of careful observation and rigorous analysis, of creative thinking and healthy skepticism. It's a story that reminds us that even things we think we know with certainty can turn out to be wrong, that new evidence can overturn established paradigms, that the past still has surprises to reveal. The footprints at White Sands, pressed into the mud 23,000 years ago, waited patiently through all those millennia until wind and erosion exposed them to modern eyes. The wooden stakes at Monte Verde, driven into the ground 14,800 years ago, were preserved beneath peat until archaeologists carefully excavated them. The stone points left by ancient hunters lie buried in layers of sediment, marking human presence in places and times that challenge our understanding. All this evidence was there all along, waiting to be found, waiting to tell its story. And there is more out there still waiting. More sites to discover, more footprints to find, more evidence to analyze. The story of the first Americans is not finished because the investigation itself is ongoing. Each generation of researchers adds to our knowledge, builds on the work of those who came before, and leaves questions for those who will come after. This is the nature of science, cumulative and progressive, always moving toward better understanding even if the path is sometimes circuitous. As sleep begins to overtake you, let the images of this vast story drift through your mind. Ice sheets calving into the ocean, sending enormous icebergs floating through cold seas. A family of mammoths browsing on the grasses of the Bering Yin steppe under the long Arctic twilight. Waves breaking on a rocky shore where a group of people gather shellfish, their skin boat pulled up on the beach. Smoke rising from a fire in a wooden shelter in southern Chile, where someone tends a pot of stew made with wild potatoes and ancient herbs. Footprints along a lakeshore gradually filling with water and sand, beginning their long preservation until the day 23,000 years later, when the wind would expose them again and human eyes would recognize what they were. These images fade and blend as consciousness softens toward sleep. The vast stretch of time becomes dreamlike, the archaeological sites transforming into something mythic, the ancient people becoming part of the eternal human story that connects all of us across all times. We are all descendants of migrants who left home to find new lands. We all carry the heritage of people who adapted to new environments, who solved problems through creativity and persistence, who cared for their children and hoped for better futures. Rest now in the knowledge that this story continues, that tomorrow will bring more discoveries, that the first Americans are still teaching us about courage, adaptability, and the eternal human drive to explore unknown horizons. Let yourself drift on this current of time, floating backward toward that distant past when everything was new, when two continents waited to be explored, when the first humans gazed on mountains and rivers and forests that no person had ever seen. And as sleep finally claims you, let the last thought be this. Somewhere out there, preserved in sediment or frozen in permafrost or resting on the ocean floor, is evidence that will add the next chapter to this story. Someone will find it, study it, share it with the world, and our understanding will deepen again. The story is still being written, the investigation continues, the path still speaks to those who listen carefully. Good night, and may your dreams carry you on journeys as remarkable as those taken by the first Americans, those brave people who crossed from one world to another, who walked lands no human had ever touched, who began the long story of human life in the Americas. Their footprints, literal and figurative, mark paths we still follow, trails we still try to understand. Rest now, and when you wake, the story will still be there, waiting for the next discovery, the next chapter, the next revelation. If you enjoyed this journey through time and want to hear more stories from history that will carry you gently towards sleep, please remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Every subscription helps us continue bringing you these calm, educational journeys through the fascinating events and mysteries of our past. Until next time, sleep well.